Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second video of this series where we will be working through Tom Howe's book titled Objectivity in Biblical Interpretation. And now for those of you who haven't already watched the first video of the series, I can invite you to do so. In the first video, we basically covered the foreword and the preface of the book. We looked at the table of contents and also a review of the book that's available on the internet. And then we also just looked at some basic background information about the book. And so as you can see in this video, we will start with the introduction. And because the introduction is so important, I will divide the introduction into its own part 1 and part 2. So let's begin with the introduction then. Now, I just want to share the table of contents again. There it is. As I said, I also made that available in the first video. And then we will start with the introduction now. Just some introductory comments surrounding the introduction. First of all, you'll see that in the introduction we will look at some questions. Because the introduction raises so many questions, we're going to be confronted with them. And we have to have some patience because the introduction doesn't yet provide the answers to the questions. It just raises the questions. And that's typically the case in most introductions of any book, which you would read, is that the problem is stated, and of course the questions are raised, the challenges are presented, and the answers to these questions and challenges will be provided as we go through the book. So we're going to need some patience, and it might seem frustrating, but that's how it works, I guess. So the introduction is divided into the following subheadings: the challenge of conflicting interpretations, objectivity and interpretation, current notions of objectivity, the attack upon objectivity with its own subheadings there, then objectivity in contemporary biblical interpretation, evangelical repudiation of perspectivism and conflicting interpretation with more subheadings, and then a summary and conclusion. And in this part, we will only look at the first half of the introduction, and then in part 2 we'll cover the second half as well. Now, Tom Howe starts with the challenge of conflicting interpretations. And to introduce us to this challenge, he basically just lists some examples of conflicting interpretations, like the fact that Christians disagree with Jehovah's Witnesses over what exactly the Bible means about certain topics, the fact that Catholics disagree with Protestants, the fact that Protestants disagree with each other, and then also the fact that even sincere people in the same local church disagree with each other. And so these are just basic examples which he uses to introduce us to the challenge of conflicting interpretations. And he goes further then to state this: interpreting the Bible is of special concern to Christians, and among those who are diligent students of the Bible, the problem of conflicting interpretations is a fact of deep concern. How do people reach contrary and often contradictory conclusions? In fact, in our postmodern culture, the more penetrating question is there such a thing as a correct interpretation? And even if there is a correct interpretation, how can I know if I have discovered it? Similar questions and issues have been the concern of the Christian church almost since its very inception, and in an effort to arrive at what they believe to be a correct understanding of the meaning of the Bible, theologians and philosophers through the centuries have studied the practice of interpretation and endeavored to establish principles that would lead the interpreter to the meaning of the text. So he introduces this challenge, the challenge of conflicting interpretations, and that it should be a special concern to those who are diligent students of the Bible. And then he goes on to state that the more penetrating question, especially in a postmodern time, is whether there is such a thing as the correct or the right or the true meaning of the text, and whether such an interpretation, the correct interpretation of the text, is even discoverable, or how do you know when you have discovered it then? So these are some of the more important questions in our time. And then he also just makes one comment here about the history of the church and that theologians and philosophers has been actually addressing these questions for a very long time. And the whole idea of biblical hermeneutics, or the study of interpreting the Bible, is to establish certain principles that will allow the reader to arrive at the correct or the true meaning of the text. So he just goes further to introduce the challenge of conflicting interpretations, and I think he brings us to the point to realize how important these questions actually are. Then he goes on to objectivity and interpretation. Now, conflicting interpretations can be the result of a variety of causes, and he mentions a few. Of course, there's probably more than this, but he mentions, for example, competence in original languages. A scholar in the original Hebrew or Greek of the biblical text will be more equipped to answer or to interpret some difficulties in the biblical text than someone who is not schooled in the biblical languages. He mentions the shortage of historical background. Maybe someone has neglected to do a thorough study of a biblical setting, or the historical setting of a text that he or she is trying to interpret. And that might also lead then to conflicting interpretations between different people. But then he also mentions this one. Contemporary theories propose that it is due to different presuppositions and perspectives. So contemporary theorists introduce the idea that the reason there are conflicting interpretations is because we all have our own different presuppositions and our different perspectives. We have different linguistic backgrounds, just different social backgrounds, and all of that impacts the way we view the Bible, the way we interpret the Bible. All right, and he lists some examples of scholars who introduces this idea. So we find this in James Smith's book, The Fall of Interpretation. He writes, "We inevitably see the world through the lens of an interpretive tradition that delivers it as something. Our reading of texts and our hearing of others are conditioned by our situationality," and he explains that, "and our traditionality," and he explains that as well. No discourse or interpretation is able to overcome these conditions so as to be able to deliver the world as it really is, to provide a normative interpretation that is purified from such conditions. To privilege one reading as normative, the one correct interpretation, would be to privilege one contingent situationality or tradition over another, a move that would be impossible to justify precisely because of the locatedness of any such justification. There is not a reading that is the reading of the world or a text. So notice here that Smith is saying that because we all have our situationality or traditionality, or what he also refers to here near the end as a specific locatedness, because we all come from that, we are located in some context, we are situated, we come from a certain tradition, and so because we have that kind of background, we can't really reach an objective view of things. We can't really reach an objective diagnosis of a certain state of affairs, or an objective interpretation about a text for that matter. And so this is the idea, and he lists another example from the hermeneutical spiral. This is written by Grant Osborne, and he says, "The simple fact is that all of us read a text on the basis of our own background and proclivities. A close reading of the text cannot be done without a perspective provided by one's pre-understanding as identified by a sociology of knowledge perspective. Reflection itself demands mental categories, and these are built upon one's presupposed worldview and by the faith or reading community to which one belongs." So Grant Osborne introduces exactly the same idea, that we have our own pre-understanding, our own what he calls a sociology of knowledge perspective, or our own presupposed worldview, and because of that we cannot really arrive at the one correct interpretation or meaning of the biblical text. Or then they also, some would also apply this to reality itself, that we can't really interpret reality for what it really is because of these backgrounds, these worldviews that we already have. And so this is the idea then. Now, two important questions at this point that are raised are the following. How do we explain it when two equally competent and pious persons arrive at different interpretations? And the second one is it legitimate to claim that one interpretation is the correct or the right interpretation of a text? That would be the objective interpretation of a text. And then especially regarding the second question, Dr. Howe states the following. Conflicting interpretations create a problem only if there is an interpretation that is the right one. Even those who claim that differing historical, cultural, and linguistic situations render the notion of a privileged or normative or correct interpretation impossible believe that they have correctly interpreted the state of affairs. Those who claim that it is impossible to privilege one reading as normative privilege their own reading as normative. And I think this is quite important because what Dr. Howe is exposing here is the idea that to claim that we cannot really reach objectivity or the true meaning of a text or just a true diagnosis or interpretation of reality, that in and of itself becomes a self-defeating claim to make. For example, he states there in the middle that even those who claim that differing historical, cultural, and linguistic situations render the notion of a privileged or normative or correct interpretation impossible, those who make that claim believe that they have correctly interpreted the state of affairs. So it becomes a self-defeating claim to say that objectivity is impossible, whether it's motivated by we all come from different backgrounds and we all have our own different worldviews, or whether it's motivated by some or other reason. It becomes self-defeating because it's presented as an objective interpretation of the state of affairs. So it becomes self-defeating. And moreover, the first sentence of this quote, conflicting interpretations create a problem only if there is an interpretation that is the right one. The whole challenge over conflicting interpretations would lose its meaning. It wouldn't even be a challenge anymore if objectivity is not really possible. Because it's only a challenge, it's only an issue, it's only a concern because we think that it's possible to have the correct interpretation of the biblical text, for example. So it would lose its meaning if we reject the possibility of reaching objectivity or the correct or the right meaning of the text. He goes on, if our historical, linguistic, and cultural situation means that there is no correct interpretation, then this creates an especially serious problem for those who believe the Bible to be the Word of God. If there is a word from God that is communicated in and through the Bible, then the fact that there are conflicting interpretations of what the Bible means creates a problem of knowing what God has said. But if there is no correct interpretation of the Bible, then there is no specific word from God that must be discovered in the biblical text. The explanation of conflicting interpretations then becomes simply the fact that different people prefer to understand the Bible differently, and since there is no right interpretation, conflicting interpretations are equally reasonable. So if we reject the idea that we can have one correct or one right interpretation of the Bible, then we'll end up in some sense at a position where we say that, well, all readings or all interpretations is just different views on things, and no view is really any more or less legitimate or valid than any other view. And what he's doing in this quote, at least, is to show that, look, for Christians who think that God has revealed himself in a book called the Bible, this becomes a serious problem because we want to discover the true meaning of what God has revealed in and through the Bible. And to do that, we must maintain the idea that objectivity is possible, at least theoretically. And if we abandon that, well, then we're going to arrive at this place where anyone's interpretation is equally valid or equally legitimate. So it becomes a serious challenge. Before the fact of conflicting interpretations can be addressed, though, the first issue to ponder is whether there is such a thing as a correct interpretation, and if there is a correct interpretation, can it be known? So that's the first thing that we need to address. And to do this, Dr. Tom Howe suggests that we start with the notion of objectivity. And this then leads us to the current notions of objectivity. Now, after Tom Howe engages with some current notions of what objectivity is, he identifies two characteristics. So he, over the course of a couple of pages, he engages with the literature out there of scholars who writes about this idea, the notion of objectivity, and then he comes to two. Then as he summarizes, he identifies two characteristics. Now, the first one is that in some sense, objectivity involves the notion of a neutral judgment that strives to be free from all biases, prejudices, presuppositions, preconceived ideas, pre-understandings, or other factors that might distort one's understanding or conclusions. So when we talk about objectivity, what we mean is, so if someone has an objective view of things or an objective interpretation of the Bible, what that means is that that interpretation transcends one's historical situatedness or one's preconceived worldview or presuppositions or pre-understanding or prejudices. It transcends those things. That's what it means to be objective. It's true for all people at all times. Regardless of their own social background or their situatedness, as some would call it, regardless of those things. That's what it means to have an objective view of something. And then secondly is the rejection of the notion that objectivity is or should be an attempt to tell it like it is or get reality right. So the two characteristics then is objectivity is something that transcends one's perspective or cultural background, but then also these scholars who write about objectivity suggest that it must be rejected. It must be viewed as something that's not possible to achieve. Okay, so that's the two characteristics that he identifies after he engages with these scholars. Now, especially with regards to the second one, we will go into more detail in chapter 2 on that characteristic. Now, the point, for now at least, that Dr. Howe wants to address is that that he wants us to take note of, is that there is an attempt in current discussions to distance oneself from the idea that it is possible to objectively know reality as it actually is. And so that leads us to the attack upon objectivity. Now, the attack upon objectivity is firstly an attack on the objectivity of knowledge. Okay, so it's not yet zoomed into biblical interpretation or the field of biblical hermeneutics. It's just in general, it's an attack that starts with the objectivity of knowledge. Is it possible to know reality for what it really is? And reality would include the written text of the Bible. So is it possible to know that? And someone who has been very influential is Hans Georg Gadamer with his historicity. And what he meant by that is the following. He meant that when he talks about historicity, it is the idea that everyone always sees and understands the world from his standpoint in time and place, which makes it impossible to rise above the relativity of your time and place to arrive at objectively valid knowledge. And so this is how Howe then elaborates. Because everyone encounters the world from a particular historical situatedness, the notion of absolute knowledge or knowledge that transcends one's own historical context must be rejected. And this links up again with what we've seen in previous quotes that I've given, and also just previous ideas in this video, where it's just impossible to arrive at objectivity because we are situated. We have preconceived worldviews, presuppositions, and those things makes it impossible for us to arrive at objectivity. So the attack on objectivity is then further narrowed down to an attack on the notion of objectivity in interpretation as well. And so on pages 10 to 11 of the introduction, Dr. Howe lists Christian scholars who, one after the other, reject the possibility of objectivity in biblical interpretation. And then one example would be this one. These authors write that total objectivity on the part of the interpreter does not exist. Of course, he lists many other scholars as well, but we'll only list this one. And notice again, as Tom Howe pointed out at the beginning, that a statement like this one would be self-defeating. He goes on, there are then two notions that seem to attach to every discussion of objectivity. First, objectivity is understood to entail a neutrality or a preconditionless approach to the text and reality. Secondly, preconditionless objectivity must be rejected as a naive approach that ignores the fact of a person's interpretive framework, historical situatedness, or worldview. This is actually just a summary of the two characteristics that he identified in recent discussions when it comes to the notion of objectivity. That objectivity is neutral in the sense that it transcends perspectives and presuppositions. It's preconditionless. It doesn't have a framework of which it is the product of. It transcends those things. And then secondly, he just emphasizes here again that it must be rejected as something that is naive, because it just seemed to ignore this idea that we all have our own unique background and presuppositions that influences our interpretive conclusions that we may come to about reality or then the written text of the Bible. And then there are two significant implications of the attack upon objectivity in interpretation. And the first one, if objectivity is equivalent to neutrality, and no one can be neutral without jettisoning the very preconditional framework that makes understanding possible. So then no one can approach the text apart from his own preconditional framework, and it is this very framework that unavoidably influences his interpretation of the text. Consequently, every interpretation will necessarily be a product to some degree of one's own preconditions, and this fact militates against one's degree of certainty about having arrived at the correct interpretation. So that's the first implication. That it will influence, that it's presented the idea that we all have our own perspective and presuppositions, and we have this situatedness to us, that then becomes the grid which through which we interpret reality and the written text of the Bible, for that matter. And then our conclusions, our interpretive conclusions about the written text of the Bible, will then inevitably be a product, at least to some degree, of our worldview, of this framework that we already have, of this unique perspective that we bring to the text of the Bible. And then secondly, the second implication of the attack upon objectivity is this. With the rejection of objectivity, there would seem to be no grounds upon which to adjudicate between conflicting interpretations. If every interpretation is the product of one's preconditions, and everyone's preconditions are the product of his own historical and cultural situatedness, then there can be no correct interpretation, only various interpretations or readings. And this takes us back to what Tom Howe said earlier as well, is that if there is no objectivity, if we must reject the possibility of arriving at an objective interpretation of the Bible, then we lose the very ground upon which we can adjudicate between different interpretations. And also, we must maintain then that each interpretation is just another interpretation on the table, which is not more or less legitimate or true, for that matter, than anyone else's interpretation of the Bible. So we lose that ground upon which we can make judgments about someone else's interpretation, and then we will end up in a place where each interpretation is just shares equal validity among all the other interpretations about a particular passage or about reality. Then he lists an example of a scholar, Webb Garrison, who wrote the following: in spite of Protestant tradition, Scripture does not constitute an objective, fixed, and inflexible source of authority. It is rather an authority which every individual interprets in the light of his total experience and present purpose. Instead of hastily condemning those interpretations that differ from our own, we shall concede that other analyses of Scripture may be valid in relation to other interpreters. In short, we shall insist upon adopting those types of interpretations that are most productive of meaning for us. And so the problem here is that if we maintain a position where objectivity is impossible, or we reject objectivity, then meaning loses its objectivity as well. And this is how Dr. Tom Howe ends. Unfortunately, with the rejection of objective meaning comes a rejection of objective truth. If truth is a quality predicated of propositions, and if, since propositions are text that must be interpreted, there is no objective interpretation, then there is no objective truth. In other words, it seems that if there is no objective meaning, there can be no objective truth. And I will end here with the first half of the introduction. So join me again next time as we finish the second half of the introduction as well. So thank you for tuning in. See you next time. Bye.